The legacy of Mew2King is a very interesting one, and by legacy I mean in terms of his melee career and his tournament results. And it's interesting to evaluate where he stands if we were to create a top greatest melee players of all time based on performances, similar to what the NBA has with the top 50 and what Bill Simmons writes, or when we look at the Baseball Hall of Fame and we compare players and where they stand with respect to their careers and their eras and all that fun stuff. Mew2King is a very interesting player to talk about for multiple reasons. The first being that he's been so good for such a long time. And by that I mean he's been a relevant player from 06 to 2015 in that he's a tournament threat to win any regional, and he's a threat to top 4 any given national. And we look at other players from when he first started, such as Chu, PC, Ken, Azen. These are the players that we highly respected in the beginning of Melee. They've all fallen, even though a lot of them have made returns, but haven't really had any direct success in a really long time. A lot of 17s, 25ths, 33rd, 49ths at nationals, whereas Mew2King still continues to place in the top 8. With that being said, it's also interesting because Mew2King also hasn't really had a definitive dominant stretch that lasted beyond a year. When we look at Ken, we look at Mango, we look at Armada, they all had distinct reigns where they were clearly the best player, they were dominant over their peers, and no one could really do much against them, and they did it for years. So Ken lasted for 4 years, from roughly when Melee started to around 07. He was the best player. Mango had multiple stretches from pound 3 to around pound 5-ish where he was definitely the best player. Armada had multiple stretch had a great stretch from Genesis 2 to about 2000 to the beginning of 2013 in which we say, well, yeah, he's definitely the best player. But with Mew2King, if you're from the documentary, it definitely overstates this. Mew2King's era was definitely a little bit overhyped. It lasted less than a year, and in that PC Chris and Korean DJ did also win against Mew2King, so it wasn't unlike Mew2King was unparalleled in that time, although a lot of his gameplay was. He still did lose quite a bit. And so, just going year by year, it's interesting just to see the career of Mew2King. If you look at 06, when he started to really come to form, his Fox was actually like really interesting because he was one of the first Foxes to really begin to string and optimize his punishes, optimize his movement. You really see this in the documentary where he talks about being frame perfect and extending combos as deep as he could, and that's something that he was able to push with the limits of Fox. And this is also when he began to really just perform really at a high level, getting 7th at MLG in New York and Dallas to start the season, 5th at Anaheim. I believe he had a couple third place performances in Chicago, 5th at Orlando, 5th in New York, and then capping that off with 4th in Vegas. So at least in that year of 06, he was arguably top 5. Ken obviously being number 1, PC Chris and Chudat being number 2 and number 3. And then you could argue here, based on what you value, Azen could have been put at number 4th. You could put Mew2King at number 4. You could put Korean DJ at number 4. But pretty much he was around that top 5 as early as 06. If you think about it, that's really impressive considering we're in 2015 now and he's still, arguably top 5. 07 was when Mew2King really began to shine. Started using Marth more, and we just see him really just take what Ken placed as a framework, or Ken and Azen, and really begin to optimize punishes, those long FD combos, those gimps, and Ken Azen were retired, and a lot of other people were beginning to retire out of Melee after MLG really kind of took a step back, and we really saw PC, Korean DJ, and Mew2King really begin to shine here. And this is the era where people would tell you, wow, this was when Mew2King was clearly the best, but And he did win a lot. He did win a lot. He won FC in the Midwest. He won Evo West and Evo East. Um, Won a couple other regional type things like such as C3 and Super Champ Combo. But he wasn't undefeated. He also lost to PC and Korean DJ here and there. And so I would argue that he was probably the best, but it wasn't as wide a margin as people would make it out to be. However, what was interesting about Mew2King was that his punish game was leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else. I would argue that his Marth on Final Destination against Mew2King from 2007 on Final Destination as Marth against the Space Animal, that his Marth can out-punish almost every single Marth in 2015, which goes to show you how impressive his punish game is today. That he really had to make very few adjustments to be where he is from 07 to 2015. 08, still a strong year for him, but this is where we begin to see the transition between Mew2King to Mango. Mango did beat him at Pound 3, beat him at ROM, and so, but Mew2King pretty much won everything else, and he was still leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else. He had like a minor couple of close sets against the Shizwiz, but really it wasn't that close when you look at it. ROM, he won 4 games, had that marvelous comeback though, but clearly number 2. You could still kind of argue maybe he could be number 1, and maybe it was too early to give Mango the crown. Despite that, around that era, I forget to mention this, 07, he does have that minor slip up, not making top 8 at Evo, which does kind of ding him a bit, but best of 1 sets, it's understandable. 09 is an interesting year because we begin to see other players begin to shine. The Shizwiz and J-Man are starting to do really well, but they don't quite get there. But this is where we begin to see players like Armada and Hungrybox begin to rise up. And at Genesis, Armada was able to defeat Mew2King, even on FD in a really tough matchup. And so Mango is still the best, but you can make a case for Armada at number 2 or Mew2King at number 2 in 09. Still a fantastic player, won a lot of almost every single event that did not have Mango in it. Now 2010 is when it starts to get complicated because Hungrybox wins Apex 2010, beats Armada. Mango starts to go Scorpion Master mode, and it's really tough to properly place everybody because of how Mango began to underperform. Hungrybox was on an upswing. Mew2King can really figure out to beat Puff. Armada didn't know how to beat Jigglypuff at that time. So it was an interesting year. You could still argue that Mew2King was anywhere between 2nd and 4th. I'd probably lean 3rd. And then we go to 2010, and this is 2010 to 2013 relatively get boring in terms of the results because aside from PPMD really rising into the ranks, it would be some combination of it was almost like there was a different winner every time between Armada, Hungrybox, Mango, and PPMD. However, actually I lie, Armada began to dominate here. But whenever Armada wasn't at a tournament, and keep in mind Armada rarely came out to the US aside from once or twice a year because we weren't esports back then and we didn't really have the money. He didn't have the money to fly all the time. PPMD started to get really good. He beat Mango a handful of times. He beat PPMD, ended up beating Mew2King at one of the Revival of Melees, and that's when we got to see him rise. But regardless, from 2010 to 2013, it was clearly established that they rarely the Big Five or the Five Gods or whatever you name it, that they rarely ever not placed in the top 5 at any tournament. They rarely ever lost to anybody, and it's understated how dominant they were, and that's why we actually call them gods. They earned the title just because of how consistent they were. The only minor blemish that Mew2King really had was at Apex 2012, where he got 17th place. He lost the wobbles, and then he forfeited the tournament to Hacks. He was juggling a lot of events at this time too, and that's something that's really understated about Mew2King's career. As a melee player, is that at every national he had to play in 4 events, and that's really difficult to do. to switch between Brawl and Melee because the feel is very different for both games. If you've ever played multiple games, you know how much it messes up with your feel, and you have to make these adjustments. And it's hard to do when you're playing at the tip top of the competition. The interesting thing to note is that from 2009 to 2012, this is where Mew2King began to fall behind. Still had those issues against Puff. Really could not beat Hungrybox. Could not beat Mango. Would go back and forth with PP. Lose to Armada almost every single time. Or he did actually for every single time for a long while. So you could argue that amongst the big five that he was probably number 4 or 5. If you look at the the collective 2011 to 2013 results. But at the end of 2013 was quite interesting because we thought that PPMD and Hungrybox were stronger players than Mew2King, but then Mew2King out of the blue wins Big House 3, which was a huge surprise to all of us because he's never really beaten Hungrybox. PPMD seemed to have his number, but he won both. The more interesting thing about that was the first tournament in which he actually won a tournament that featured 2 or more other gods, and that's an interesting statistic that I kind of harp on him about in terms of diminishing his legacy, is that he can win when there's one other god, but when the competition gets a little stiffer, he never wins, and that's a trend we see even today. 2014, this is where we see Mew2King's stock rise, and it's really interesting because we all thought Mew2King was going to fall off in the end of 2013, and then he wins Big House, starts beating Mango a bunch of times, although Mango had a kid and he was in Ohio. Mew2King ends up getting second at Apex 2014, still dominates any small local or regional, gets second at Skitar 3 and second at Apex 2014, so those are very impressive performances. Summer Smash, I actually really did hope that Mew2King could actually win a Super National, and I was actually really hoping he would. Ends up falling short, 3rd at MLG, 5th at Evo. Still impressive. I'm mixing up my years. So he got 5th at. Did he get 5th at both years of Evo? I believe he did. Let me think about this. Yeah, he actually did. He got 5th both years of Evo. 3rd at MLG. So a lot of performances that were in the top 5, but he would never really win, which is unfortunate for him because ultimately, this is talk about legacy, it's really tough when you look at sports, especially because people will only remember the teams that win repeatedly. So that's why we remember the Bulls, remember the Lakers, remember the Celtics, the Spurs, because they win multiple seasons, and we don't really ever remember the runner-ups. We don't remember the Pacers or the Knicks or the Suns. All these teams are runner-up because we remember winning, and that's one of the biggest hindrances when we put stock into Mew2King. On one hand, he's been really consistent, top 5 for countless years, as I've just talked about, but he's never really won anything big, and that's for over the past 7 years. The biggest tournament he's really ever won that featured really good competition was Big House 3, and even then, that didn't really include even include all 5 of the gods. It didn't include Mango. It didn't include Armada, and so I wouldn't even really call it that big of a win when you look at the grand scheme of things. But still, even though he's slowly moving on to Brawl, not Brawl, he's moving on to Smash 4. You can kind of see it in his performance. In the latter half of 2014, after the Summer Smash, you really get to see a decline in Mew2King's play, especially with the amount of losses he's been taking to non-top 6 players. Losses to Nintendo, Axe, Shroomed, Amsa, Silent Wolf, all these players that are slowly catching up to him. Fiction too, I forgot to add him, that are beginning to, make the sets really close, if not start to begin to beat Mew2King. And this is more so that the competition's been getting a lot better, and not so much that Not so much on Mew2King as much as everyone else is getting better. But still, we're in 2015, and I'd still put him at number 5, number 6, and that's still impressive, given the number of people that play Melee now at a high level. And overall, he has 5 good characters that he can play at arguably a top 10 level. His Sheik is legendary with their games. His Marth has probably the best punish game out of anybody to this day. He has a really underrated Fox that wins a lot of Dittos. He's been lucky, he's been Colbull, he's been Leffen in Ditto, many games of sets that have swung in his favor because he's been able to win the Fox Ditto. He has a Peach for certain matchups. He can play Puff in teams. He has a decent Captain Falcon too. And he's definitely developed the metagame. He's pushed people to their limit. He's evolved Melee so much just because of how much skill you need to beat him. He's always going to be a great a gatekeeper to show whether or not you're really, really good at this game. I think he's that litmus test. And so, yeah, fantastic player. He's been good for 10 years, which is crazy considering that even when you look at other esports or fighting games, a lot of people slip after a few years. In some aspects, I would say he's almost like the Justin Wong of Smash, in that Justin Wong was really good at one game, transitioned and became good at multiple games. Mew2King in that regards is the same way. Yeah, he's good at every Smash game, even 64. And so when we look at him overall, the things that ding him include just not really winning anything when all the chips were on the table. Never won an Evo, never won an MLG. Did win a big house, and he hasn't really won anything considerable in the past almost 6 to 7 years. And so overall, I'd probably put him around number 4. Mew2King, that's still really high. Depending on what you value, you may put him higher, and I could get by. I can understand that, but overall, I put Ken, Armada, and Mango higher, not in that order, just simply because they have much of a more memorable legacy in terms of having, this dominating streak that lasted many years. And so, yeah, Mew2King at number 4 is where I put him. Very solid player. That's been an inspiration to, many of us that have gone into Smash.